Hi, this is John Pettigrew, and you're listening to Talking Through My Hat, a podcast that explores bookish businesses, the fantastic people who create them, and what those people have learned. I'm a hat wearer, a recovering editor, and the creator of Future Proofs, enabling editors and authors to work better online. To find out more, visit wearefutureproofs.com or follow me on Twitter at John_Pettigrew. Welcome to this week's Talking Through My Hat. Today I'm talking with Michael Bhaskar, co-founder of digital publisher Canelo, author of The Content Machine and Curation, and also writer-in-residence at Google's DeepMind with the Ethics and Society team. That should all give us lots to talk about, so welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Hello, it's great to be here.
So let's start with Canelo. How do you describe that business, if someone hasn't heard of you before?
Well, I'd basically say we are a digital publisher that focuses on finding incredible stories and then taking them to the mass audience. And it really is that simple, to be honest. We want to be a kind of technologically minded and forward-thinking publisher, but at the heart of what we do really is about just finding unignorable, just completely absorbing stories that you can't put down. And that is the core of our business.
Okay, cool. So why did you decide to do that, to set up your own business? You had a perfectly good career for someone who paid you money, and then you thought, no, we're going to do this other thing.
Yeah, I had a really great job working at a great publisher, Profile Books, and I had a lot of freedom and I had a lot of interesting projects to go on. So yeah, it sort of seems in some ways like a kind of crazy thing to give that up for what, when you first start is very uncertain with a startup. I think there are a couple of things. One is that I always felt that it would be a kind of important, interesting thing to do in life, to work on a company from the ground up. Uh-huh. And secondly, and more importantly, I think, is that myself and my co-founders felt that the publishing industry as a whole had, to some extent, sidelined and ignored the digital market, that the ebook edition was considered to be the kind of poor second cousin of print edition, and that despite the fact that it was evidently an important part of the industry, it wasn't taken seriously. And we thought that was wrong because the readers were there, the readers took it seriously, and so the publisher should.
Which is kind of the basic thing, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then also combined with that, we just thought that, if you kind of do digital publishing right, you should be able to offer authors a much fairer deal. And so we thought, actually, if we can do this, we can offer something that is giving a lot to authors. And what's interesting is that, since we started the company, there have been quite a few other digital publishers that have started, but I think nobody offers royalties as high as we do, and no one has the license flexibility. So I think we've still got an offer that is just profoundly fair and advantageous to authors. And so, that's about trying to use technology to give a better deal for authors, also to find more readers, and also just to take the whole area seriously. Yeah. So all of that just felt like an opportunity. And it just felt like it was a kind of now or never thing, to be honest. And, as I always say to people, it felt in some ways like a huge risk to give up a comfortable job and just go into business with my colleagues, creating a new company. But equally, what kind of really convinced me is I thought, actually, there's a huge risk in not doing it. That it's one of those things in life where if you don't do it, you'll probably always regret it. And actually, although these things are very risky, not doing something is also actually a risk.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, you try and do some things differently with Canelo. What is it that you think is distinctive about your approach? You mentioned royalties. Are there any other kind of, how does that fit, and what other things do you do that kind of separate you from what we might call a traditional publisher?
Well, I guess there are sort of two areas in which we would hope to be a bit different. And I guess the first is in our contract, where we don't pay advances, but we have royalties starting at 50%, going up to 60% of all net receipts. We let our authors get their rights back after 5 years. Our whole contract and approach is built on being really, really simple, really transparent. So, for example, when we give royalty breakdowns, it's, multiple people have said our royalties are the clearest they've ever seen. We're just totally transparent about where the sales are, which territories, and so on. So there's an approach with authors that is built on a kind of very fair and simple model that is very different to a traditional contract.
Approaching it more as a partnership, by the sound of it.
Yeah, it is as a partnership. Obviously, we understand that if somebody's going to pay an author a huge amount of money up front, that's quite difficult to ignore. But actually, when you look at our royalties and the flexibility within that, on a best-selling book, it can really, really pay off for authors. And, in terms of our publishing, we publish a lot of kind of back catalogue where we take on the whole oeuvre of a writer. And so there can be quite a lot of books there, and then it does quickly accumulate.
And it helps avoid that mid-list trap where someone doesn't earn out their advance. If there isn't an advance, you don't have that problem. You're starting from a more straightforward economic position, I guess.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because, a couple of years ago at the London Book Fair, I wrote an article on just that mid-list problem. And, it's happening left, right and centre at traditional publishers. I mean, and it wasn't really something we'd factored into a huge degree when we started the company, but this has become quite important in the sense that, if you look at writers at the big publishers, you have to be selling an awful lot to just justify the time and investment of that publisher. So they are brutal at dropping the sort of so-called mid-list authors. Just is a very difficult situation for the author and the agent. What's interesting is that actually a lot of those mid-list authors have really, really respectable sales and they have really strong core followers. They're for us, we look at these authors and we think, hang on a sec, this is great. This is an author with a kind of a really good kind of core that we can build on. And whereas at a massive publisher, they're sort of not a big priority. For us, they can be a big priority. And so we can work really closely with them, re-energize the work and really kind of build the audience again. So actually finding a way of making what has become a sort of an area that's impossible for big publishers, we can actually really turn that to our advantage. And it means we can work with so many incredibly talented authors who otherwise would kind of be left in the lurch to kind of keep building their career. And so that's been brilliant for us and it's something we love doing.
So you mentioned, I kind of sidetracked you a little bit because you mentioned there were two things you thought were distinctive about you, and one was the contract and the way you work with authors. What was the second one?
And then the second one I think is just to try and have something akin to a marginal gains approach to publishing, whereby we try and rethink all the little areas of publishing that other people perhaps aren't paying attention to. So, for example, our cover format, we do for the Kindle, we do wider covers than almost anyone else. That's because you basically can, and that means your books take up more of the real estate on the screen, so they kind of look bigger and more prominent. So all of our covers kind of come in two dimensions: the traditional dimension, and then also a bigger dimension. Then what we also do is all of our covers kind of extend out into a kind of poster format, which is designed to be shared on Facebook and Twitter. So if you look at literally any of our covers, they can form this kind of rectangle, which is a kind of ready-made shareable that will fit perfectly on the social media channels. That's a kind of, every cover we do is effectively 3 different covers working in different environments, all of which are optimized for different digital platforms. And that's just kind of one thing where it just involves rethinking a little bit about some of the kind of norms of publishing. we publish most of our books on a Monday, for example, because no one else does, and everyone else publishes their books on a Thursday. That maybe works when you're going for retail slots and traditional publicity and so on. You don't need to do that. So actually, why go up against everyone else when you can do it on a Monday and potentially get a bit more attention?
Yeah.
So I think it's just an approach to digital publishing that is just trying to use what it is to be the most effective publisher that we can be. But core to that is that we want to take the best of traditional publishing, and we think there's a lot that is really good, but then combine it with the best of a sort of proactive digital ethos as well.
Yeah, that's funny. That's kind of almost exactly the same words I used to describe what we do. But obviously
really?
a different area,
Yeah, because I think that's probably is the best. Publishing is an interesting industry in that it is always marked by these kind of extraordinary revolutions and upheavals and changes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's always marked by a lot of continuity as well. And that's one of the things that really interests me about it. And so I think if when people come and they say something like, the whole publishing industry is just totally tired and rubbish, and we're here to completely disrupt it, I'm suspicious of that.
Yeah. The assumption that what is being done at the moment is completely wrong seems unlikely. I mean, obviously there are things that can be done better or things that might be wrong, but that everything is wrong just doesn't seem plausible, is it?
Yeah, it's obviously not true. There are still things that say editors and publishers have been doing for years, just making books polished and better. That is still of enormous value. And, I think outsiders to the publishing industry typically just misunderstand huge parts of it. The thing that they misunderstand more than anything, actually, is how few books the average book sells.
Yes.
You speak to somebody in tech and they would almost just assume that every book's selling 100,000 copies because, how could you have an industry where you had products that are selling fewer than that? And then, you might tell them it is drastically fewer than that. And suddenly, their calculations change.
Yeah.
I've spoken to people whose kind of business is predicated on finding the new Harry Potter, and you sort of,
well, good luck with
raise an eyebrow at that and think, that's a once in a generation event, potentially once in a lifetime event. And just to build a business premised on finding the next one, not necessarily. Yeah, it's pretty risky to say the least. Sort of against that is, and certainly when I first started working in digital publishing, which was pretty much 12 years ago, there was an enormous amount of resistance and skepticism to any form of new technology or change or new business practices in publishing. And that was a very ingrained thing. And I'm skeptical of that as well, because, if you just sort of think, right, well, it's all fine, it's all good, we're just going to sit here and do what we've always done, by the same token, that's probably not right as well. So,
again, the assumption that everything is perfect is just as implausible as the assumption that everything is wrong.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's great. You mentioned a little while back, you obviously got a team you work with there at Canelo, doing all these different things. How did you find those initial co-founders, and how did you think, at some point someone must have said to the one, we should set up a business. How did that come about?
Well, it was the impetus behind it. I would have to give full credit to my co-founder Ian Miller, who was then the digital publisher at Quercus. So in the end, there are three of us who co-founded Canelo: myself, Ian Miller, and Nick Barretto. Ian and Nick had worked at Quercus, and obviously I'd worked at Profile. And I knew Ian from the Independent Alliance and just from the sort of digital publishing scene. And we were kind of friends and would go out and have a drink and talk about, just life, really. And then in the end, he just said, look, there's this opportunity. We should try and start a digital publisher. And at first I thought that was kind of, wow, bit of a out there suggestion. But then as I sort of thought more and more, then, you start thinking about the opportunity and all of that. So it was really just over beers, Ian sort of pushing and saying, this is something that we can do. This is something that could really happen and be extraordinary. So, you start just with the very that idea, and then sort of slowly, look to see who might be interested. And it just kind of carried on from there and starts snowballing and until the moment you hand in your notice.
Which is kind of a fun one.
Which, well, it's both fun and a bit nerve-wracking.
A little bit, yes. So how did the three of you, as you came together and were putting this together, you're all kind of publishing types. How did you work out what responsibilities you were going to take on for the business? Because you can't have three publishers. You need someone to do the finance and legal, you need someone to do the operations and all the different parts that come together. How did you split that out between the three of you? Was it just an obvious thing that each of you had a preference, or was there a certain amount of horse trading?
No, to some extent it's an obvious thing.
Mm-hmm.
For example, so my colleague Nick, who is the technology director, he is an ebook developer, so it's sort of natural that he would gravitate towards systems, technology, ebook production, and all of that kind of thing. Ian was the managing director from day one, so to some extent he'd be more focused on things like the sort of legal and corporate side. And then that sort of left me, who was doing quite a lot of editing and commissioning a profile, to be publishing director. So I think it was a very natural division, really, of labour. But what I would say is when you've got three people in a company, everyone's doing everything.
Yes.
And we were all kind of and even to some extent now sort of still kind of you have to kind of have your hands in a lot of different areas, simply because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's if we're all kind of as co-founders responsible for the business as a whole, so that kind of brings you have to be paying attention to all aspects of the company, I'd say.
You're quite well known for doing lots of stuff as well. Obviously, you've written a couple of books about the industry and how it kind of fits together. And then recently, you've taken on this role at DeepMind. How does that, particularly that work at DeepMind, how does that connect to Canelo and to your books? Is there a connection in your head, or is it a separate thing that you do for different reasons?
It is quite different, and I think I've always been writing and working on those kind of projects alongside doing a full-time job, pretty much. So when I hear about writers or people say, I just can't ever find the time to write, I think, actually you've got to get up on Saturday morning and get stuck in. And at the end of the day, a day of working, go to the library and do some more, and that's kind of just what you have to do. I think it all, to me, adds up to just kind of looking at information and media and culture and business, and how all of that ties together and keeps mutating in interesting ways, and just being involved with that from a number of different sides and thinking about it while doing it. And I think there's this sort of divide in the world between just getting stuck in and getting on, and then somehow sort of write about it or think in hopefully an original and interesting way is something totally separate. But for me, it always has fitted together in an interesting way, to be honest.
But how do you balance those different aspects of your life? You're a business owner, you're a writer who reflects on it, and you're kind of doing consulting for someone else as well. You said you just have to find time for it. How do you find time for it? You just running a business can be all consuming.
I think there are a few things on that. One is I think you have to be quite focused on what you're doing, and I think it's very easy to kind of get into a place where you're not just like, bam, this is what I'm working on, this is what I'm doing. People sort of chop and change. And you really have to be, when you're doing something, you're really doing it and focusing on it. And so I think that's one thing, and just being able to compartmentalize and just sort of really focus. To be very organized in your work and your approach, and just have like very clear things that you need to do, to have a kind of understanding of what is required, and make sure that you hit that, but then be ready to move on to the next thing. And then, to be honest, it is just a lot of hard work. And I think, you have to be willing to put in the hours and the time, and to sacrifice free time, in order to actually just get things done. And that's not easy, but that's basically what you have to do.
Yeah. So how do you go about learning to run a business better? You start off, you had experience working for other people, but doing it for yourself is always a little bit different. Do you read books to learn? I mean, I'm guessing you do, given the nature of your writing, but do you read books to learn about running the business? Do you look at websites? Do you talk to people? How do you kind of go about that process of doing it better?
I think, you read, well, I think I've become more open to sort of reading books and to sort of engaging with what in a former life I probably would have called management bullshit. Simply because, as a company gets bigger, you do realize that to some degree you need to be organized, and management bullshit can be helpful at that. I think talking to people is probably the number one thing. And just going out there and being really open and talking to experienced, brilliant people. I mean, I feel incredibly fortunate in some ways. And I think, most people would say this, to have, had some people they've worked in over their career who are extremely inspirational and who they've learned just an extraordinary amount from. Not just sort of little professional things, I guess, but just how you go about doing stuff, how you conduct yourself. So talking to people and watching people, I think, is really, really important. And the other thing that I would put equally up there is you make mistakes. And you try and learn from them. I think it's almost impossible in whatever you do to kind of not make mistakes. And I think when it's a company that you've started, you really feel those mistakes on a personal level. They are painful, and that makes you learn fast. And I think you have to sort of acknowledge that there are times when in whatever area there is a kind of you do something that's just not quite right, or that doesn't work. That is going to happen. But then you have to try and learn from it and get better. And I think that's certainly something that I would say we have tried hard to keep learning. And, that process of learning is probably always slightly more difficult and tricky in practice than it might seem when you just say that. But it is nonetheless, I think, really, really important.
And considerably more painful. I just say that the mistakes can really hurt. So what is it that you find hardest about running a business personally? Do you hate the finance, or is it the hours, or what is it that you find hardest, and how do you kind of get past that?
I think one thing that is difficult is simply kind of, as you mentioned, just managing the workload. And for example, I'm an editor to quite a lot of writers. I think that comes with a lot of responsibility and commitment to those writers. So I'm sort of constantly trying to think, how can I ensure that I'm available enough and able to devote sufficient time to their books. And I think the challenge for me actually is doing the stuff that is about looking at the more high level stuff, that big questions that we just sort of touched on, with actually just doing a really, really good job. So it's that kind of dual role, I think, is a challenge.
Lifting your head from the trenches at the same time as actually having to get the work done. Yeah,
that is a challenge, I think.
So what have you learned about yourself from the last 3.5 years of setting up and running this business? Are you still the same as you were kind of 4 or 5 years ago? What have you learned personally from that?
I would definitely say it have changed a lot. One thing, honestly, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound too twattish, but I think I feel a lot more aware of my limitations than I did before starting on this journey with my colleagues. And, I think in some ways you sort of realize what you're good at a lot more, but you also realize the things that you're not good at or the things that you struggle with. And I feel much more, I think, when perhaps it's getting older as well. When you're younger, you perhaps don't have such a keen sense of where your limitations lie. But then, the more kind of challenges you face and things like that, I think the more you get an understanding of that.
So in the face of all that, what's the thing that then keeps you coming back every day to Canelo and sitting down and getting on with it?
I think just loads of things. I mean, I sort of really just incredibly excited and confident about it, and there are just so many elements that keep you coming back. And there's the books and the authors. So many incredible books. Just all the time. Seeing writers see their careers grow. Just, one day I'm working on a kind of incredible murder mystery set in some foreign location. The next day I'm on the ramparts of a Roman battle, etc., etc. That's sort of incredible, and love working with the authors. Then there are just all of my colleagues, obviously the co-founders, but everyone else in the company. We're a really tight-knit team. We work hard together. And, just sort of seeing that the team come together and really kind of collectively build this new kind of publisher is really inspiring. And that honestly keeps me coming back. And then lastly, just to kind of watch the opportunities be realized and to understand like how much more there is that can be done. Yeah. That, you see where you start and you see where you get, and you just think that's incredible, but wow, there's still a lot more out there. And that's exciting. That's motivating. You just think, wow, there's still so much that can be done.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, Michael.
No, pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So thanks again to Michael for that really interesting discussion about all the things he's been doing. And one of the things I love about Canelo, beyond the kind of the obvious things that we kind of see, that it's a digital-first publisher of ebooks, is the way that the economics works differently for small publishers than it does for big ones. That they can take a mid-list author who's neglected by the big players, but who can make a lot of sense for a publisher like Canelo. And also the way they take, as he described, the marginal gains approach to improve just lots of different aspects of what you do, which may be small changes individually, but they add up to give a really big overall result. And one of my little bugbears that he picked up on, the way that outsiders from the publishing industry, although we need to learn from outside perspectives, the way that outsiders, by nature misunderstand often huge parts of how publishing works. From basic stuff, just like how many copies an individual book actually sells, to the reasons that we go about things the way that we do, sometimes for very good reason. We need to knock some horses over, but we need to keep hold of some things that are important to the nature of the industry. So thanks very much to Michael. As we release this podcast, it's the Frankfurt Book Fair 2018, so I hope you have a really good fair if you're going. If you're listening to us while you're at the fair, I hope it's a really good time. Come back and listen next week when I'm talking to Justine Solomons of Bite the Book. And of course, please, as always, do give us a like or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your podcasting platform. It really helps other people to discover the podcast. See you next week. This was Talking Through My Hat, a podcast by John Pettigrew, founder of We Are Future Proofs. Please let me know your thoughts by leaving a review at Apple Podcasts or by commenting on the website, myhat.wearefutureproofs.com. You can subscribe to this channel at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our theme music is from hooksounds.com.